It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast, Film Seizure, that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Let's go to the late 50s, where Universal was still making horror movies. Their classic monsters were just recently a thing of the past, with The Creature Walks Among Us in 1956 being mostly considered the end of the Universal Classic Monster series that began in 1931 with Dracula. And that can be heavily debated. The reason for this is that for the next 4 years, Universal still made another 10 horror films with mostly the same formulas, and in many cases, the same scores reused from earlier films from the 40s. It should also be noted that all of these classic monster movies cranked out by Universal, only 2 were ever made in color: The Phantom of the Opera in 1943 and 1955's This Island Earth. That was really only retroactively included because of the Metaluna mutant that ended up becoming a very popular creature and being very well received. It could be debated if the Gill Man could even be included as one of the classic monsters too, but I digress. We can also debate the beginning of that era, because Universal went back to The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923. Dracula normally gets the nod as the first because it was the first sound horror film that Universal made, and it launched the whole thing into the stratosphere for them. But the Universal monster movies can be considered to have gone as late as 1960 with The Leech Woman starring Colleen Gray. And that's where we kind of are this week with this late 50s thriller that gets listed among Universal's classic monsters movie, but is often debated if it's really part of that cycle or not. 1958's The Thing That Couldn't Die. This stars Carolyn Kearney as a woman who has some psychic powers. Now, Kearney didn't make too many movies. She mostly appeared on TV westerns, but did appear in some B-movies like this one, and a couple of juvenile delinquent flicks that were popular at the time. She was notable for kind of having this sweet face, kind of a fresh-faced person, but had a little bit of a bad girl streak in her. That's something we'll talk a little bit more about in this movie, because I feel like that's how this role landed in her lap. Now, what makes this movie interesting comes from several angles. One, this is a little more about psychic powers than an actual monster. A monster shows up, but he's also a psychic monster too. So it's less a ghastly creature and more of a mental villain. It's often considered to be a really low-rent and bad movie. It appeared in the Season 8 episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000 when the series went over to the Sci-Fi Channel and had access to Universal's library. However, I don't think it's quite as bad as it gets the reputation for. Sure, it's only 60-some minutes long, and it's not exactly the best-made movie of its time, but there are some creepy factors to this movie that we'll talk about. Sure, it's Universal kind of running out of steam with their cheaper horror movies, but I think there's something here. In fact, there is something to this movie that did possibly inspire the 1972 Spanish film Horror Rises from the Tomb, starring Paul Naschy. And Naschy was the undisputed king of Euro horror at that time, so it's not like The Thing That Couldn't Die was incapable of inspiring other filmmakers with its plot concepts. So let's talk about those plot details and concepts. The movie begins with Jessica Burns, played by Carolyn Kearney, and she's trying to find water using a practice called dowsing. That's when you use a forked stick to try to divine where water may be found underground. And there are other things that it can be used for, but most of the time you'd see it when people are trying to find water. It's mostly considered to be hokum. But on this ranch is Gordon, who knew Jessica before he left for college when she was only about 13 years old. He's returned and finds Jessica to have grown up quite nicely. He doesn't believe in her divination powers. She tries proving her powers only for it to lead to something under a tree that she begs not to be dug up. When everyone else says she must be crazy to think that what's buried was evil, because they all think that it's either going to be water or it's going to be a treasure, she starts yelling about how awful everyone is, and she hopes they all die and hopes a tree falls on them. And just then, a big branch falls out of the tree and lands on Linda, another guest at the ranch. Now, this doesn't kill Linda, but Jessica is scared that what she's done is speak an evil wish. She wants to give up all this psychic stuff, and Gordon says that he can prove that she's not really psychic anyway. He asks her to tell them where Linda's missing watch has gone off to. And Jessica says that it was not stolen by a person and it was not lost, but it was actually taken by a rat and put into the tree by Linda's cabin's window. And sure enough, they find the watch. Gordon apologizes to Jessica and kind of cozies up to her. She says that she often hears darker voices speaking to her as well. But Gordon gives her this fleur-de-lis that he also found in that rat's nest. This is basically a cross with the fleur-de-lis kind of wrapped around it. And he says that he knows that the charm works by protecting those who have faith in that charm. Now, the ranch's handyman continued digging by the tree, and they finally find an old chest. Now, Jessica's aunt believes that it has to be gold. She wants her handyman to bust it open, but Gordon says that she needs to keep it intact because it has historical value as a treasure, and what a museum would pay for that treasure could probably be worth more than the gold inside it. The chest also has a warning for those who open it, but Gordon wants Jessica's Aunt Flavia, to wait until he can bring an expert from the university to the chest to check it out. Jessica sees them bringing the chest into the house, and she tells her aunt she doesn't want it there in the building. In fact, she won't even stay in the house as long as the chest is there. Linda lets Jessica stay with her in her cabin once Flavia refuses. While the handyman Mike, who's kind of dim-witted, he watches over the chest, the foreman on the ranch, Boyd, convinces Mike that he could probably just bust open the chest with his bare hands without even messing it up. And Boyd gets the key to the room that the chest is being kept in, and they go in, and Boyd uses this dim-witted Mike character to open that chest. Now, Boyd expects a treasure to be found, which he will probably steal. What Mike finds is the head of a man known in the 16th century as Gideon Drew. He was executed for sorcery, and his head is still somehow alive. And what's more is that he can control other people's minds. Drew has Mike kill Boyd with his own knife. Mike then gets instructions from the head to hide it and Boyd's body. Flavia wakes up realizing that the room with the chest in it has been opened. She calls for Jessica, and she reminds her aunt that the box was evil when she sees the puddle of blood on the step. Outside, Mike carries the head around, and Drew sees that Jessica is wearing the charm that was found near the chest, and it prevents him from being able to take over her. Now, Gordon returns with the historical expert, and Gordon says that he saw no car passing him when he returned. So that must mean that whoever the blood belongs to must be somebody on foot. So Jessica uses her dowsing powers to try to find whoever was bleeding. And Gordon and the expert read the rest of the inscription about Gideon Drew, and Drew recognizes that Jessica's power is that she can find things and wants to use her to try to find his body. If his head is reunited with his body, he will regain his full powers. All of this is basically explained when Jessica faints and appears to have a vision of Drew's trial and execution. When she wakes up, she finds Boyd's body in the hole where the chest was dug up. When Jessica and Linda sleep in Linda's cabin, Mike brings Drew's head to the window and kind of taps on the window, which Linda gets up and looks out and sees Drew's head, and that takes control of her. With Linda now closer to Jessica, Drew has Mike approach the police who are investigating Boyd's murder. When he refuses to stop approaching them, and he's also holding the knife out that killed Boyd, the police shoot Mike dead. Linda acts coldly to her fiancé Hank, who's also staying at this ranch, and acts weirdly around Jessica, asking her constantly to remove the necklace that prevents Drew from being able to control her mind. Jessica refuses, which means that Linda has to try to carefully remove it while the girl sleeps, but that doesn't work either. In the morning, Linda gets really weird by staring at Jessica all morning long and even offering to buy the necklace off of her outright. Now later that same day, Gordon says the chest never contained treasure, only the head. He also jokes that the head is obviously missing because it's searching for its body. The historical expert says that he does want to find that casket with Gideon Drew's headless body, and that he wants to pay Aunt Flavia handsomely for it. Linda, of course, with the motive of wanting to try to find her master's body, suggests that Jessica could try to find it with her powers. When Flavia asks Jessica to do it, she flat out refuses and shouts that she hates everyone and that she's going to leave immediately. As Jessica prepares to leave for her cousins, Gordon asks to have the necklace in order for him to make a cast of it so that it can be appraised. Linda realizes that Jessica's no longer wearing the necklace anymore, so she gives her a quote-unquote gift that happens to fit in a hat box. Inside, of course, is Gideon Drew, and it takes control of the young psychic in order to find the rest of his body. She surprises Gordon by revealing that she's not left, as she said she would, and that she will help find the second casket. Gordon realizes that she's grown cold and is acting very differently. She does find where the second casket is located, and they dig it up and take it inside. When they loosen the binds on the casket, the body moves on its own and stands up without its head. Jessica comes downstairs and reunites the head with the body, and Drew tries to figure out which one of the collected witnesses here will be sacrificed, but Gordon figures out that the necklace was the key all along, and he uses it to force Drew back into his coffin. When he tosses the necklace into the casket with the sorcerer, it decomposes the body all the way down to his bones. Jessica and Linda regain their free will, and the evil has finally been totally destroyed. Now let's get to my 3 things that I like about this kind of peculiar horror movie from Universal. First, this is a pretty bizarre idea. Back in the time of Sir Francis Drake, there was a guy who practiced evil shit. Okay, sure. The guy is found guilty and sentenced to death. Okay, but not just death, mind you. He's sentenced to beheading. So now, the guy who loses his head over this trial is still able to remain alive for 400 years. He has psychic mind control powers and uses that to have servants. Okay, that's not much different than Dracula or anything like that, but in the present, most importantly, to find the rest of his body so that he can be full again and have all of his powers. That's pretty original. If it wasn't for the Paul Naschy movie in 1972 possibly being influenced by this, I would have to assume that no other movie in history of movies would have all of these things in the same plot. Now, second, there are some pretty explicit stuff in this movie. First, the villain of the movie is a disembodied head. Yeah, that's kind of gross. Also, they explain that after 400 years, with some of the acid that's in the soil of the area, his skin is probably leathered now, and that's pretty gross too. We even see the execution, which for 1958 is not expected, even if it is clearly a special effect. I mean, the guy's getting his head chopped off. And I'm curious how they got that past the censors, but at one point early in the movie, it's clear that Gordon is definitely a fan of how Jessica's grown up. And based on the dialogue, it's likely that she's only 17 or 18 if he's not seen her since leaving for college, and he himself is fairly young. He's not exactly hiding lust for her. On top of that, Boyd, the foreman on the ranch, tries peeping on her when she's getting into a fairly see-through nightgown. Then it's more or less saying that Jessica's attraction to Gordon has kind of quote-unquote loosened her up a little bit to want to feel pretty in that nightgown, and so on. Also, when Linda and Jessica are taken over by Gideon Drew, they become harsher, more like femme fatales than the nice quote-unquote normal girls that they were before. They are portrayed a little sluttier now because they were tainted by the sorcerer. None of these things are necessarily all that new, especially because this is about the start of Hammer's era, where they definitely ticked up in gore and sexuality, but the whole movie feels like there's an extra charge to it that you hadn't really seen in the previous monster movies from Universal. Now, thirdly, I really do like Carolyn Kearney. Again, this is something that is probably revealing a little more base tendencies and attraction than anything that I can specifically defend with well thought out arguments. But Kearney is a very cute, if not straight out, attractive woman at that time. As I said previously, she got roles for having a kind of girl next door look to her, but there are things that she can do with her eyes or expressions that reveal something darker to her. Often that was to give her that bad girl streak in her characters, and that gives her a little bit of edge in her looks. She goes from sweet and kind of naive to shouting how she hates everyone and wishes they would die. It just adds a little bit of excitement to her. Now, I don't know if she's all that good of an actress. Some of her lines sounded weird. They also sound like that they might have been dubbed in. Of course, it's very possible they could only work from one take at a time on a relatively low-budget movie. But it is possible this movie was filmed without sound to save money, and the actors looped their dialogue in post-production. I don't know, and I don't think I really care. Kearney is still cute, and she is dangerous because of that. She's someone barely hanging on with a power that might go really badly, especially if she starts listening to those evil voices that she talks about. When she turns, it's like she suddenly realizes how she can use her body and looks to get things she wants. Or more accurately, what Gideon Drew wants. That's attractive in the most sleazy of ways, but it does often work in these movies. Call me nuts, but I do think of the cute psychic girl in this movie before I think of the disembodied head monster. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. And don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. When I come back next Monday, I'm making a return trip to the world of Carl Kolchak as he returns in the 1973 TV movie sequel, The Night Strangler. And until next week, stay spooky.